It is a facilitated discussion today. If you'd like to speak, could you use the chat function, please? And I'll go back to that in a minute as to where that is. But if you use the chat function, if you pose any questions or make any comments, then our facilitators can bring you in. The hand function is great, but perhaps not for as many people that we've got on the call today, which I think is around 60, 70, and it can get a bit difficult to manage. So if we use the chat function, then we'll bring you in if you've posted in that. If you can keep your contributions when you bring you in to around 30 seconds in length, we can hear from as many people as possible, and we'll do our best to bring people in, but we'll try and work on a first come first served basis, but obviously trying to stick to the point that we're covering on at the moment in time. You can see the hashtag there on the screen. If you're using any social media, using that hashtag would be great. And then just a quick run through of Microsoft Teams then for anyone that's not used it before. If you move your mouse around, you'll see at the bottom of the screen a grey bar appears. Here you'll find a speech bubble, and there might be an orange circle in it. It means you've got unread messages. If you click that speech bubble, then you'll open up the chat pane and you're able then to pose questions. If you haven't got that chat pane, there's a bit of a bug sometimes in Microsoft Teams. If you log back out and log back in, that normally solves the problem to bring up the chat function. Okay, thank you everyone. So if I could just remind people to keep your videos and your mics off as much as possible unless you're speaking, that would be great. I'm going to pass you over to Anna now, who's going to introduce the session. Diolch.
Great, thank you, Matt. Croeso pawb. My name's Anna Nicol. I'm Director of Strategy and Sector Development at WCVA. So diolch am ymuno gyda ni heddiw. Yn anffodus, dyn ni ddim yn gallu wneud y simultaneous translation ond achos technoleg, ond popeth arall yn dwyieithog. Delighted to welcome you here this afternoon for our final hashtag Different Futures Wales or ddyfodol gwahanol Cymru sessions. This series is about bringing together voluntary organisations from across the sector and beyond to discuss the impact of COVID-19 and implications for the future. We know that the future isn't set in stone. Different futures are possible, good and bad, coming out of this. So we want to explore those in the session and look at who needs to do what if we're going to create a better future for Wales. What do we need to do now? We have, as well as the conversation, people have fed into the survey. Oh, hands up, the cats turned my camera off, sorry. People fed into the conversation on registration through the survey. Thank you for everybody who's done that. And also, there's a ongoing survey that covers sort of topics wider than what that you can put in topics wider than what we've been covering in these direct sessions. So that's open till the end of tomorrow. So please do contribute to that if you wanted to. Richard Newton is joining us to listen into the conversation and has been drafting a report from each session, which will be made available and will circulate widely, including to decision makers. So thank you to Richard, and thank you to Jess Blair, who's also listening in and will be drafting a quick blog that will go out next week based on the discussion. And if you look at the views section on our website, then you can see that's also a link to previous blogs, reports and recordings from these sessions. So please do make use of the hashtag at Different Futures Wales or also hashtag ddyfodol gwahanol Cymru for the session and to keep the conversation going on afterwards. That would be great. So I'm really looking forward to this session on the wellbeing economy. You've decided to do this one through the Twitter poll, and I know we're going to have a great conversation over the next hour. So I'll hand over now to Sue Husband, who's Director of Business in the Community, who we're doing this session, in partnership with Business in the Community, and I'm delighted that she can be with us today. So hand over to you, Sue.
Diolch, Anna. So good afternoon, everybody. Prynhawn da, and welcome, croeso, to this webinar. I can see we've got a really good number of you here today. So firstly, thank you very much for joining us. And it's a healthy mix of participants. So I'm really looking forward to what I'm sure will be an interesting conversation. As you know, these sessions are an opportunity for people from across the voluntary sector, business and beyond to share their experiences and ideas. The purpose of this session is for us to gain a better understanding of how COVID-19 is impacting on communities, voluntary organisations and businesses, what we've learned and what the implications might be for the future. We hope at the end of this hour we have some ideas and some actions to help move this agenda forward and to better understand our roles in shaping a wellbeing economy for Wales. So thank you to those of you who were able to complete the questionnaire, as Anna mentioned, ahead of this session. There were 4 key questions in the context of COVID-19 that were covered in the questionnaire, and I wonder if we could just bring those up on the screen now. These questions were, what has the impact been on the economy and its impact on our well-being? What possibilities has COVID-19 created that could lead to longer term change, and that's both positive and negative? What are the implications for the voluntary and business sectors in Wales? And what could voluntary organisations, businesses, WCVA, business in the community, government, or other decision makers do that could help steer us towards that better future? I thought it would actually be helpful to start by actually giving a summary of some of the comments that we've had to that first question about the impact on the economy and well-being, so we can spend a little more time on the other 3 questions. So that the summary of sort of the answers that we've had so far to that first question about the impact on our economy and on our well-being, there are a lot of comments from you about isolation. That's physical isolation and loneliness, isolation from a digital perspective, and further exclusion of vulnerable groups. There were several comments about the impact on mental health and increased anxiety, and that's due to that isolation, due to job losses and also the anxiety about job insecurity, and reduced access to organisations associated with wellbeing. And finally, I think the challenge probably we're all facing of home working and schooling, or if like me today, you've come into the office of a phone ringing in the background that you weren't expecting. So apologies for that. And finally, there were a few comments about increased poverty, and what we're all seeing that increased reliance on food banks. And I think overall, there's a real sense that the impact will obviously be greater for those who are already in a vulnerable situation. And this is exposing some of those fragilities in society. So I'll pause there a moment and just see if there's anyone who has something to add to that, who might not have had the chance to complete the questionnaire. So Ben, I don't know if you've had any comments so far. And if not, I might just call upon, I don't know if the Community Transport Association have dialed in, because their comment was on a national level. Wellbeing, and that being viewed as separate to health, has all but dropped off the radar. And it's only been the focus of the voluntary sector that has ensured this holistic view of maintaining wellbeing is kept in mind, so vulnerable service users are supported and protected. I don't know, would you like to join the conversation?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to.
Hello, hi.
Hi,
Gemma.
My name's Gemma. I work for the Community Transport Association. I'm based in South Wales. So a lot of our members work with very vulnerable people that are very much at risk of loneliness and isolation. A lot of them have been involved with supporting deliveries of food to vulnerable people, as well as things like shopping and prescription deliveries, transport to medical appointments. And understandably, on a national level, the focus has been on making sure that everybody is as safe as possible and protected from the virus. But the kinds of services that people rely on to maintain their sort of mental health and well-being have had to cease. So there's been a lot of pulling together from the voluntary organisations that we work with to try and enable those people that are maybe not able to access the day services that they once would have gone to, or the social groups. Our members have been involved in trying to create opportunities to do that in a different way. And I think those are the things which it's going to be really important for the voluntary sector to maintain, because we don't know how long this is going to be, and we don't know how isolated people are going to continue to be. I think it's going to be really important that that is seen as a really essential function of the voluntary sector going forward.
Okay, Gemma, thank you. Thanks for your contribution. Ben, I think you might be have something to add there.
Yes, well, just apologies for not turning myself off mute earlier. The curse of COVID teleworking strikes again. There's no one in the chat comment who's indicated they'd like to speak yet, but as well as the discussion about the impact on community transport, there's also an interesting section in the in this responses from CAVs, I think, about the closure of facilities and the impact of facilities on communities. If anyone from either CAVs or from a community-based organisation that has struggled to or has overcome the challenges of providing services whilst their community facilities are closed, that would be, I think, a helpful discussion for how those facilities underpin a wellbeing economy. Jackie Dorian from CAVs is willing to is able to speak. So.
Fantastic. So Jackie, could you come off mute and share your camera if you're able?
Yeah, there we go. Hello, everybody. So from our perspective, you know, a lot of community provision in West Wales has been closed. So we've seen an impact that's had on not just the older generation, but the younger generation as well. You know, right across the board, it's a place where people go. It's the hub of their community. And with that being closed, then they're not actually able to go to play groups, the kill, you know, whatever provision. And, you know, a lot of the community village halls are big enough to have sports happening. So, you know, short mat bowls, etc., badminton, some of them. So the impact on them has been huge. Their loss of income, massive. And just as we ease out, you know, they're all starting to think that they can open and everything will be okay. They're putting things in place, but actually there's a massive piece of work to do before anybody can open, you know, checking their insurance cover, checking that, you know, everything is safe. What are they going to do after one group has been in? How are they going to manage cleaning that? And, you know, we also know that people who tend to be as trustees on village community halls or community halls tend to be the older generation. So some of them will be isolated, some of them shielding, some of them, you know, over 70. So what implications will that have? They may have to buy people in to clean, you know, making sure that everything is cleaned before the next group goes in. So there's a huge raft of things to think about with regards to those facilities, and they've had to be paying rates along the way, and actually if they've not got any reserves, then that may have, or very little reserves, that will have an impact on that organisation as well. And bearing in mind a lot of the facilities over in West Wales, Carmarthenshire, are quite old, so you know, as well. So we've got to think of all the different angles. Yeah. I can see Di Davis is here as well, from Carmarthen Town Council, Community Council. Well, he's clerk for 3, so he's got 3 community buildings potentially that he's looking after as well, or facilities. So you know, very much a case of we need to be supporting those groups. We need to be helping them to come out of lockdown. We need to see what is available for them, because they've not had funding really available to them, and I think that's a big issue, to be honest with you.
Thanks, Jackie. And I think it's at these times, it's one of those very unique situations where everybody is impacted in some way. So at a time like this, where you may be able to call upon someone who isn't in a crisis situation to help, the fact that everybody is, I think also particularly interesting what you're saying there about the kind of people that would ordinarily be stepping up in these situations might not be able to. Yes. So thank you for that contribution, Jackie. Yeah. Would anybody else like to come in? Ben, I don't know if you've got anyone else who'd like to come in on this first question before we move on.
There's a couple of interesting comments about backlogs in referrals to various organisations, one from David Smith in relation to the NHS and one from Fran Target in relation to advice services. But just before you call on either of those if they're willing to speak, I just want to remind people if they can turn off their cameras when they're not speaking, please. It helps with the bandwidth for people with poor internet connections. Thank you.
Okay. So we go to Fran next then, about advice services. Fran.
Hi. Yeah, I'm just quite concerned. I've been in conversations with a number of advice providers, both across Wales and actually across the UK. And although there's been spikes of inquiries, particularly around the immediate impacts of the COVID situation, there is a sort of backlog of issues that are going to come through, and real worries about For instance, what happens to people if we're talking about well-being and economics, when, for instance, the delays that people have been allowed in payment of their rent and other delays come through, and how long the lag is likely to be in terms of the need for that additional advice, plus a whole set of issues about new people who are, if you like, new to needing advice around things like benefits because of the shift of the numbers of people who are becoming either redundant or claimants in some way that have never been in part of that sort of system before. And then a really big concern that I think is not just within the advice sector but elsewhere about what we're calling the disappeared. The people who haven't got access to a computer. They might have, if they're lucky, a smartphone, but that's perhaps all, and they are paying through the nose for their access to Wi-Fi and can't afford to actually access the sorts of services that we who are more fortunate are able to do. So real concern about how we get the disappeared, the people who for all sorts of reasons don't have access to digital back on board.
Yeah. Thank you, Fran. And shall I just come to David? And I missed your surname, David, but it was a comment about the NHS, I think, and delayed appointments, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. I think probably most of your participants will be aware of Dr. Julian Tudor-Hart's inverse care law, which states that those in most need usually get left well behind and don't access services that they actually need. And I see this inverse care law being reinforced by COVID-19. And I think that's a real concern. There's been quite a substantial drop-off in people actually attending not only A&E, but appointments that they've probably been waiting for maybe 6, 9, 12, 18 months, if it's for, orthopedics or whatever it might be. And I think personally speaking, my partner had an appointment that was to take place at the Royal Gwent. It was transferred to Neville Hall, but involved seeing a consultant from the Royal Gwent in Newport. It involved the radiography department. People in that department didn't seem to have any understanding of basics like at-risk assessment in terms of explaining how people were going to be, how they could organise their functions between COVID and COVID. So you could actually separate out nurses, premises, equipment, and so on. And until that's actually built in, there's not going to be any reassurance for people actually taking up much needed appointments. And the longer they delay, the more serious the consequences in terms of loss of life or increased spend on health expenditure, more time in hospital, more time at home actually recovering. So there's a whole raft of issues that are actually impacting on the system, quite apart from the impact that there will be on the NHS if we have a second wave of COVID, let alone any future pandemics that might be lurking in the corner. So I think there are real issues around the NHS and making sure that staff there are tested regularly 2 or 3 times a week to make sure that they avoid becoming hot spots as we have at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. And I wonder, forgive me, I think if we move on to the second question now, because I want to give everybody a chance to participate and us to get through the full questions. There's some strong themes coming through there about general well-being, about people's health, the long-term impacts and based around things like finance and isolation, but also I think that point made about the infrastructure that's in place to support individuals suffering as a consequence as well, and it will need to be there more than ever, not just in this sort of recovery stage, but post the crisis. The second question we asked was around what change this could create in the longer term. So, you know, what possibilities has this crisis created that could lead to longer term change? That's both positive and negative, but I wonder if we start with if anyone sees any positive opportunities from this awful situation that we're in at the moment, and if there is anybody, Ben, I don't know if you've had any comments on that to share at the moment, otherwise I can look at some of the things that had come through the survey.
I think at this point it would be great to look at what's in the survey, and then Jess McQuaid may want to come in on the green recovery afterwards as well. Okay.
So I think, you know, a general comment that had come through is about recognition for the importance of looking after health and well-being. I know there's been lots of comments about seeing lots more people walking, riding their bikes, etc. So there's the two sides of that. But also there's a comment about the opportunity to adopt a different societal approach with stronger and closer communities. And there were various comments about some of the impact this has seen to show communities really pulling together. Do we have Home Start Cymru and Valley Steps on the line? And if you are, would you mind joining the conversation? Because you've talked about how this is an opportunity to do things differently with more social cohesion and mutual support.
Well, that's me.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us.
I think for both Home Start and Valley Steps, I mean, Valley Steps, what, you know, Cwmtaf region, and pre-COVID, we only delivered sessions to groups of people face to face. And thanks to a lot of hard work by our teams and lots of support from the health board and local government and so on, we're now delivering online sessions. And so that means we're covering more than just Cwmtaf. We are covering people who, particularly with mental health problems, would struggle to come and, you know, go to a church hall or a sports club or whatever, and enter a room where there are 10 or 20 other people sitting down. We've also extended the range of things we can offer. So in many ways, you know, there have been lots of opportunities, but going back to an earlier comment, I, as a former GP myself, I'm very concerned about the hidden people. And some years ago, when I was a clinical director, there was a lot of enthusiasm for online email and remote consulting with GPs. And one of the very big companies that was marketing it and had fantastic marketing materials sort of slipped in the actual evidence base for why they were getting such satisfaction rates. They were getting marvelous satisfaction rates from young, fit, mobile, IT-friendly people. They weren't engaging with ethnic minorities, they weren't engaging with older people. There was a whole range of people who were simply hidden to their study, and then they had 90% success rates. So I think we do have, you know, I agree with Julian Tudor-Hart's perspectives and that wisdom. I think with Home Start Cymru, it's different. What Home Start Cymru normally would do would be to provide a volunteer to meet with parents and children in the home. And there's all sorts of benefits from that. We have things like mobile phones for all, you know, and ways of contacting all our beneficial users and so on. So we can do that remotely, but on the other hand, we're now missing all sorts of things. And our chief exec had a wonderful phrase in passing, you know, what are we not seeing with our ears? And if you're not in the front room, how do you then pick up the non-verbal clues about domestic abuse and all that kind of stuff? So, and again, we're finding opportunities for collaboration. We're finding exciting opportunities for partnership. But at the same time, you know, wearing, if you like, if I look at it thinking about coming out of COVID and post-COVID, I think there are going to be threats. There are going to be concerns about how we go back to the way we've done things since Home Start was started. How do we make the most of these opportunities? And it was interesting that I think it was in yesterday's WCVA newsletter, which has been very helpful, by the way, thank you. There was a thing about mergers. And I've been, you know, coming from an NHS background where you will not be surprised to know I've wanted to support the third sector and local government and have not always found collaboration top of the agenda. Sadly, it's often been competition and doors shut in people's faces. I've been surprised now that I'm involved in the third sector much more, that still competition and ego seems to drive quite a few people. And I just wonder how COVID is going to change things.
Yes, and from my personal experience, Jonathan, I think I have found through this crisis people much more willing to be open and to new ideas and new ways of doing things, and also of working better with other people, especially in their community. So I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that. So some positive things that have happened as a result of COVID. Ben, do you have anything that's standing out?
Jess McQuaid would like to come in on the green recovery, I think, and then there's a bit of a conversation in the chat from people who are finding the positives of being able to engage with people digitally. So if anybody would like to come in on those on that issue, please just indicate in the comments, just say I'd like to come in on this, and we can have a bit of a chat about the impact of that, but also how we make sure that it's available to everybody. And just before we go on, just remind everyone again, there's a few people who have their cameras on when they're not speaking, and just want to remind people it'd be best if they're able to turn that off for saving bandwidth for people. Thank you. Okay,
and I can see Jess has kindly come onto camera and off. So hi, Jess.
Hi. So we are looking at the economic system, or trying to. I mean, it's complicated. And trying to see the impacts. We've been looking at this for a while anyway, because one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss and contribution to climate change is our economic system. So we've been looking at this for a number of years, trying to see where we can change that to have stop having such negative impacts on the climate and nature crisis. So what's happened with the COVID crisis, we've actually seen, and there's growing evidence, including a WWF scientific report, which links the transference of the pathogens from the kind of the destruction of the forests and the natural resources into a human space, because human and nature are becoming much, much closer. So there is a real link, and then obviously the drivers of that deforestation are very much linked to our commodity and food systems. So if we're looking at this from a global economic perspective, that, part of our Wellbeing for Future Generations Act requires us to, and then how that impacts on how we have an economy in Wales, it is all interlinked. So when we kind of start to look then at what economy we've got in Wales, we have an economy which is very much traditional economy, which is driven by GDP, GDA. And there's been lots of calls from other countries who are starting to look at this model and go, this is not working, and starting to move into what's called a wellbeing economy. And there's kind of an alliance of countries, Scotland, New Zealand, a few Iceland, I think, who are starting to look at what it means to move beyond GDP as how we define our economy. So that would start to try and embed natural capital and social capital into how we define our economy. And then that becomes the wellbeing economy as a whole.
I was reading somewhere the other day, Jessie, the gentleman, I can't remember his name, who actually came up with the concept of GDP in the first place, has said that this is never what it was intended for, and people have used it, as a measure when it was never intended for that. So it's good that people are now starting to really, seriously think about moving away from this as a measure.
Yeah, totally. And it's not that we'd get rid of it by any stretch, but there needs to be other things that are built into the definition of economy, which then kind of plays down at how your relationship you have then with your global supply chains. You might want to then start to be looking at where you localize those. So currently our food system has kind of basically crashed almost because of COVID, and you can see kind of local production and distribution, and there's a lot of third sector and community organisations have been massively involved in that and redistributing kind of how we access and grow our food. So that's one example of where kind of this global supply chain has been moved to local.
Yeah.
So that will have real benefits potentially for jobs and communities, etc. in Wales, if we kind of capture that moment that we've got now where the system's been disrupted, and we start to look at how we rebuild the economic system through the interventions that Welsh Government can do to enable that not to go back to business as usual on steroids. Because when you have a crisis, you'll have the old system trying to come back hard, faster, on steroids, GDP growth, but then you've also got this other narrative which is around let's try and stop those systems that were causing so much destruction into our communities and our natural capital. You know, Wales is in poverty, our nature in Wales is decimated. So let's look at those systems that we can replace in our economic approach to restructure that. So I'll probably stop there. And there's a lot of conversation towards the end of the climate discussions that we've had here around the same thing, around kind of economy. So yeah. In WWF, we're working quite closely with other members of the NGOs, and we're trying to look at the green recovery. So Welsh Government has agreed to a green and just recovery. So it's like, as a sector, we need to really push forward what that means in practice. And there'll be a lot of kind of discussions, certainly from environmental NGOs, around what are green jobs, where do they exist, what jobs need to be invested in, and what can be done rapidly, what can be done kind of medium term. So things like energy efficiency can offer loads of jobs to the community, and actually voluntary sector organisations can be involved in that. But actually, that's more medium term, because people aren't going to be able to have people going in their homes yet. So actually, the conservation job is which jobs are shovel ready for whatever reason, versus which jobs can. So that's when we're looking at how we define it. Sorry, I could go on.
Could I? No, because I know, I'm sure you're very passionate. I know it's great to hear. And I'm conscious, because there was that discussion, wasn't there, recently about the economy. So I suppose it's about the environment. I wonder if we could just see if there's any questions around. You mentioned about sort of the stronger local economies and those shorter supply chains, and some of the. It was a comment literally in the questionnaire about people seeing the benefits of that, or anything related around this opportunity, Ben, you know, about really switching the economy now?
There's a couple of chat comments coming in, which I think will be in the next couple of minutes we could probably go back to. Just before we do, I think the mentor ring, sorry, I don't know the person's name, only the organisation name, would like to come in on digital. And as well as the discussion about that sort of more local economy, there's also a bit of conversation going on about community volunteering, which if anyone wants to come in on, it'd be great just to highlight that in the comments as well.
Okay, great. So I can see the mentoring guest. I'm so sorry we don't know your names. If you want to introduce yourself and just... So you're on mute, I'm afraid. So the mentoring guest, you are on mute.
Sorry.
Okay,
sorry. I'm Sujata Taladi from the mentoring charity based in Butte Town Community Centre. So all our community activities now have gone online. We used to do coffee morning and yoga sessions and other sports events for children as well as for young people and adults. So there are positive facts about getting online. It took a while. We had to go sometimes to the elderly and then download some software and explain to them over the phone. We have used our volunteers who could go and do that. It was very positive, and they were very excited to see faces because they are not used to sitting at home and not having guests, especially BAME community people. We love to have people coming to our house, or we love to go within the community. So they liked looking at somebody's face online. So that really had an impact. Initially, it was very difficult, but now they got used to it and they don't have to have any problem with the transport. That was the biggest issue. They couldn't drive.
Oh, so that's, in a sense, a positive. And what have been the challenges, Shajad? So I guess getting out there and getting them online.
Challenges was they don't know like mute. See, I myself forgot to unmute. Small things like this, and we have to tell them they can't hear. Sometimes hearing problems, some may have hearing problems, and language. Some people cannot understand. We have to talk slowly and, make them understand. We have to change our jargons, and we are a mentoring charity. So when we are mentoring them via Zoom or WhatsApp video calls, it's difficult to know the body language sometimes, so we find it very difficult. We also had issues with the volunteers speaking with another mentee. I think either technology is a problem or the accent, they couldn't understand. So we had those issues, but positive is they're very happy that they could see other people from other communities as well. And it's not restricted to Cardiff, though we are based in Cardiff. we are now all Wales. People are coming from different areas. So that is so good. So that's why when we're applying for funding, they say, are you based in Cardiff? I said, no, now we are whole Wales or whole world, global, you know. So it was very scary. Month of March and April was very, very challenging emotionally for them, because they used to ring us and say, what's happening? You know, what number do we ring? What happens? Is that a cough? I got it. You know, small things like that. We are not doctors. We're not GPs. They're not supposed to go to GP as well. There was mixed messages that was very challenging for our clients. One, they have multiple barriers. They're so isolated as it is. And we used to say, don't get isolated and come out. And now we are saying, be isolated, don't come. And it was that's what, you know, we're talking. So we used to speak something until February, come in, join us. And then we say, get out, you know, just be isolated. So they don't know, they couldn't understand the mixed messages from even team, how safe.
So Jad, I think you've given us quite a nice kind of leeway into move into the next question. And Ben will sort of forgive me if we start that and then we can come back to a few other things, because I know he mentioned about community volunteering. But the next question is about the implication for the voluntary and business sectors in Wales. And I think, you know, from what we've heard so far, there's been a lot of need to adapt. There's been challenges with funding and being able to have the right resources to do things differently. But interestingly, I think one of those points you made there about people come to you and there might be a primary purpose that you're there for, but you know, users of your services will often come to you for all sorts of other things because you are the friendly voice, the friendly face, the person that they trust. So I wonder if anybody wanted to come in on the implications for the voluntary sector, particularly in Wales. We've touched on a few already, but Ben, was there anything you wanted to draw my attention to, or someone that you might think want to speak?
Well, there's a conversation going on in the chat comments around how we make the I guess the rhetoric around wellbeing economy and the legislative framework Wales has realistic, and how we bring that out into communities. Sue Leonard from Pawb has made a few comments about that. So if you'd be willing to talk about your thoughts on the implications for the voluntary sector of making that real. And also I know that Sandy Club had made a few similar comments. Sandy, if you'd like to come in as well, please just indicate in the chat comments.
Okay.
Are you available, Sue?
I think so, yes, I can see.
I'm just trying to turn my video on. Okay, I don't know if I can turn my camera on.
Don't worry, Sue, that's fine. We can hear you. So.
Okay, that's great. Well, actually, this morning in Pembrokeshire, Pawb and Planed and Solve for Care co-hosted a strategic conversation with partners from across the local authority, health, public health, community groups, voluntary groups, you know, established voluntary groups, about 40 people in the conversation, and also including young people from the Youth Assembly in Pembrokeshire. And actually, it was a really uplifting conversation. And I think that, you know, we've really tried to make a big commitment to do things differently. We do feel that, you know, people were saying we needed to really try and keep it simple, but we did want to work really closely with communities, with all the groups that have come together during COVID, with the established voluntary and community groups, with town and community councils and elected members, and the 125,000 people who live in Pembrokeshire. And they're not separate to all of those other people, we're all the same people. And those are our assets, and there are community buildings, you know, and other assets that we can mobilise. And I think we just wanted to focus on what we can do in Pembrokeshire and what communities can do. And we understand that we need to do things very differently. And one of the beauties, one of the fantastic things in the last 12 weeks is that we've been given some freedom and flexibility from national policies and funding streams that come down in silos. And you know, we've been given some flexibilities. They've lifted the straitjacket and we've been able to focus on what's happening in front of us and work with people in communities to make things better. And that's what we need to continue doing. My fear is that we come out of it and we'll drift back into our usual pattern of strategies and action plans and, you know, little bits of money that come down in silos and have loads of restrictions. And, you know, we just need to get away from all that and trust communities and trust local people to actually, you know, to do things well. So we did have a very positive conversation about that in Pembrokeshire. And we are committed to having some kind of citizens' assembly in Pembrokeshire and to make our PSB work more effectively to get things done. And communities do need some investment. And actually, if you took a little bit off all of the budgets, health, social care, economy, environment, because communities can contribute to all of those things. And how much would it be actually to just invest in communities, give communities some delegated budgets and some delegated powers, and let's see what happens then.
Sue, that's great. I think I think we all need one of those sorts of meetings, don't we? At least once a week at the moment, because most of the time it's really quite difficult stuff we're dealing with. But it's good to hear that that is working and that there are groups coming together and having those conversations. And I think it's interesting what you're saying about trusting people locally. I think this crisis has required trust because we've had to get on with things very quickly. But actually, people have, you know, on a very large scale acted in that way and really delivered locally. So I think there's some really important points in that. Ben, anything coming through on the chat where somebody else might like to add and build on Sue's comments?
Yes, there's a bit of a discussion ongoing about measuring wellbeing in GVA, or measuring wellbeing alongside GVA, both from Jessie we heard from earlier and also from Sarah Hopkins. Maybe if Sarah would want to offer her thoughts as well. If that's okay, Sarah?
Yeah, and I think waiting for Sarah to come on, I think, Ben, that is so important, isn't it? We all know, you know, what you measure is what gets the attention. So if Sarah is able to just come off mute, and thank you, Sarah. Hi, we can see you. And just to come off mute. So you just need to come off mute, Sarah. Oh. I don't know if anybody else.
Sarah, you're still on mute.
Still on mute. See, it's all ages who struggle with technology. Still on mute, Sarah, so we might not be able to get to you if it's not working. No, so I think while we're just waiting for Sarah with her technical issues, any other thoughts on the implications for the voluntary sector in Wales? Would anybody else like to come in on that measurement? David, you've actually put your hand up. And thankfully, because there was only one of you, I can spot that. So, David, did you want to just have a comment on those implications for the voluntary sector?
I was struck very much by what Sue said, Sue Leonard, and you can see a broken field. And you could also see the way in which this may well solidize or re-solidize over the coming years, over the coming weeks, as people actually seek to draw back on power that they previously had. So it's not clear to me how we can actually maintain the momentum that's been achieved. I think probably we can keep the momentum by being very focused on the storm that's going to be ahead for the Welsh economy, potentially with the loss of Tata Steel, what's going to happen to Airbus. Ford UK seems to be off the map probably very shortly. So there's going to be an economic storm hitting Wales, and we can't continue in the same old way. There's got to be a change. And I was very struck by an article in Forbes magazine, and I put a link in the chat box. But Cox actually says, as we recover from the pandemic, businesses around the world will be looking to rebuild in a way that puts people first and protects the communities and the environment which they rely upon. And so I think the key message is business must do good to do well. And if it does that, we will succeed.
And thank you, David. I think that's a really helpful point to go into the last question, because I'm conscious we're sort of coming to the last 15 minutes of this session. And, you know, there's lots of early signs that some of those businesses that act responsibly generally are coming through this better. Because they had a really, based on their values, the way that they operated, they've got strong supply chains that they've looked after and they've nurtured. So together they've been able to weather this storm perhaps more than businesses that weren't, didn't have strong value. So I think it will be interesting to see how businesses come out the other side of this and whether they do indeed build back better. But as I say, there's quite a bit of evidence to say those with more robust systems and behaving in a better way normally. There was a Warren Buffett quote I read the other day that said that when the tide comes away, you exposes the people who were swimming naked. And I think this crisis will have exposed some organisations that probably didn't have robust, good structures in place. I think we could probably talk for hours, but I think the last question that I just wanted to touch on, because this is important, because this is about some sort of action and next steps, it was what could we all do to help steer us towards that better future? So what actions can we take? Because I think we probably amongst us have strong ideas about what needs to happen. Sarah, I'd love to come back to you, but I think that you probably have got problems with your audio, so you're not able to. But Ben, are there any sort of comments on the chat about what steps we should be taking?
Yes, there's two people who commented who I hope might be able to speak. One is Natalie Sargent from I think the Coalfields Regeneration Trust, who's posted a report they've written about the impact on towns and cities, which obviously would be a helpful part of this discussion. And then Duncan Holton from the People and Work Unit on the implications and what the voluntary sector needs to do, which I think is probably another side of this discussion, as well as asking what statutory partners would want to do. Yeah. So if either Natalie or Duncan would be able to offer some of their thoughts, that would be really helpful.
I can see Natalie first. That's great. Thanks, Natalie.
I say sorry, we can't claim credit for the report. It's just on our website. So yeah, no, it's a report that is by the Centre of Towns. So but it was just very useful because it's looking at the next stage really coming out of COVID and where we foresee the most impact really. And it's, as we would expect, the coastal towns and the valleys towns. So it's just some really good piece of research really that may be of interest to some of the people that were attending today. So, but yes, can't take the credit for it, I'm afraid.
Well, thanks, Natalie, though. But I think that is really important because I saw something the other day that showed a report about England and Wales and the 20 most hit towns and cities because of this crisis, and 10 out of the 20 were in Wales. And when you look at the different populations, that's a significant imbalance. So definitely something that we need to be thinking about is the particular impact on place in our recovery. Duncan, I think you also just came into the conversation, so please join us.
Thank you.
Oh, Duncan.
Yeah, so as Ben was saying, we've written a report for the Sorry, as Ben was saying, we recently wrote a report with my colleague Sarah Lloyd-Jones for WCVA in terms of looking at the role of the voluntary sector in terms of shaping a new economy for Wales. And I think some of the key themes around that, and thinking about some of the challenges the voluntary sector faces, are very pertinent here. I mean, I think as has come through the discussion today, I think there are real opportunities. There is an appetite to do things differently. I think there has been an increase in partnership working between the voluntary sector and the statutory sector, and that's been a really positive thing. I think in part it's been driven by the fact that the public sector often hasn't been able to respond, and the voluntary sector, certainly parts of the voluntary sector, being able to step into that breach. I also think things like all the online meetings and so on have actually, in a sense, democratized the process and made it much easier for the voluntary sector to get engaged. I think, though, there are some real challenges for the voluntary sector going forward, and I think I'd focus on three in particular. I think one is funding, which is a perennial issue for the voluntary sector, that it needs funding in order to do the work it does. And I think you wouldn't be optimistic about the impact the crisis will have upon funding going forward. So, and at the same time as funding may be cut, I think demand for the voluntary sector is likely to increase. So that will certainly be one of them. I think another key challenge for the voluntary sector is scaling up. Often the very things that small community groups do well, their person-centred approach, their knowledge of the community, their strong local links, and so on, are in a sense tied to being small and being part of communities. And if they're trying to scale up to do more, to increase their capacity and so on, it may undermine the very things that make them so effective in the first place. Now, that's not to say voluntary sector organisations can't scale up, but I think it's recognising that there may be differences in terms of what small groups do well compared to what big groups do well, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think the third point I just wanted to flag up, find my notes, sorry, was around measuring impacts, and obviously that's come out in the discussions today. And I think one of the things that came out very clearly is often funders will measure, what funders look for is often very narrow. So for example, one example in the report was I think it was the local authority funding a community centre to provide nursery places, and all they were interested in was how many nursery places were being provided, and completely missed the broader value, the broader social value that community centre was providing in terms of the social interaction between parents coming to pick up and drop children at the nursery, people coming to the cafe, all these kind of wider benefits and so on, which is completely missed. But because they were being missed, you really weren't recognising the value and contribution that the voluntary sector makes. And if it's going to play a bigger role and for its potential to be recognised, I think it's critical we find better ways to measure and really value its contribution. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think a valid point, Duncan, because I think sometimes, we're so obsessed with measuring outputs than say, or even outcomes actually, because they're a final outcome, that we forget about the important activity that might help to taking somebody on 3 steps out of the 7 or 4 steps, but maybe they don't quite get to the 7th. So I think that being able to measure the human impact, the things that have helped somebody at least move closer towards a positive outcome. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
I think just very briefly on that point, I think it's also getting beyond kind of some of the silo thinking that, a particular statutory body might do one thing without thinking about all the other things that flow from that funding. So it's looking at a much broader perspective. I think Thank you.
Ben, I'm conscious of time now. I've been scribbling some things to attempt to summarise, but is there anything else you think we should add to the conversation before we...
So just before we go, if anyone has any thoughts on how this links to the Welsh Government's foundational economy agenda, I think that would be really helpful. It's come up a few times in the chat, and obviously for the current government, that's a big push. I just have a nod to, and we definitely don't have time to discuss either of these issues by giving them justice, but there was a small sub-conversation in the chats around the value of universal basic income for a wellbeing economy, and the second, a comment in response to Duncan, I think, from Sue Leonard saying, do we need to scale up, or actually should we be looking at cascading learning and spreading into other organisations rather than size directly. But if anyone does have any thoughts on the foundational economy agenda, there's a couple of minutes now just before we need to tie up, if anyone wants to come in on that.
Anyone brave enough to tackle that topic? So I think that looks like probably not at the moment. I would say what's so valuable about this is all going to be captured, isn't it, Ben? So I think I, for one, have been told not to get too distracted with the chat today, because I think I probably would have. So it'd be good to know that we can capture all of your thoughts. So I think at this point then, I just want to say thank you so much, because this has been so interesting. And I know with all of these things, you always feel that you could go on for another hour. And I hope that this has felt like one of those conversations that you go away from feeling invigorated, at least having lots of ideas about other things we can do. So first of all, thank you for your participation, not just in the call, but on the chat and, before the call in that questionnaire. I think some things that have struck me, or actually impressed upon me, those things that you're hearing anyway, is that through this crisis, we know that it's those that were the most vulnerable that are being hardest hit. And that now more than ever, voluntary organisations and local support is really needed. So that's really very obvious to, I think, all of us. I think there's something about the fact that through this crisis, the necessity for allowing more freedom, more trust, and if we can just maintain that, so many organisations, particularly locally, have been doing some amazing work, and the voluntary sector particularly, and individuals. So if there is some way of holding on to that freedom that's been granted and the trust that's been built up when it was really, really needed, but that there's an absolute need to invest further in this, because for all of us to come out the other side stronger, there needs to be some investment made so that we can make the necessary changes. So funding is a big part of that, that conversation that needs to be had. I think that we can do more to demonstrate the value of the voluntary sector, and by that I mean to those that may not see it as much as they should. It's been absolutely invaluable. It always has been, but it's really been shown to be that through this crisis. So there's some way of really demonstrating that to enable more funding. And then the final thoughts, I think we've talked a bit about, the adapting, the sharing, the collaboration, maybe scaling up, but it's how you maintain, if you were to scale up activity, how you maintain that value that comes from something being very small and local. And to get that mix is quite a challenge, but organisations do that. And then I think the final thing I'd say is just about what this has enabled us to do is have real clarity of focus, that people have really focused in on what their purpose of their organisation is and being able to, stick to what they need to do and what they need to deliver, and have been really passionate about doing that. So I think an incredibly valuable conversation. Thank you all for your input, and sorry we weren't able to get to more of you, but as I say, I know that this conversation will have been captured. I think, Anna, I'm going to hand back to you now just to sort of say a final few words.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Sue, and thank you to everybody for their contributions and participation today in the conversation as well, but also in the chat. We've had lots of lively discussion that is looks like it's continuing. So as Sue says, we will bring these sessions together into a final report, also drawing on the surveys that people have been responding to, and as I say, last chance to fill in the broader survey by the end of tomorrow to contribute to that. We'll be publishing a final report which we'll make available widely. Do take a look at wcva.cymru website. If you go onto the news and views, you can get access to the blogs, but also the reports from the individual sessions and the recordings. And please do keep the conversation going at hashtag Better Futures Wales or hashtag ddyfodol gwahanol Cymru. If you've got more to say. We've mentioned some related work today, including Duncan's think piece. So next week we'll be publishing 3 think pieces and podcasts to go with them. One on a new economy related to the topics we've been discussing today, also one on climate change, and one on health and social care services, and about the role that voluntary sector can play in the transformation there. So again, they'll be on wcva.cymru, and we'll be using hashtag Better Futures Wales, ddyfodol gwahanol Cymru to sort of to carry on the conversations around those. And as ever, we'd be really delighted if people wanted to get in touch. You can get in touch. That's on the screen there. You've got policy team at wcva.cymru if you wanted to email us directly. So I think just leaves me to say a big thank you for the WCVA team who've put on all of these events over the last 6 weeks. I know it's been lots of work. Also to Jess Blair for the concept, and also the her blogs that she's been doing, and Richard Newton for the reports that he's producing. But thank you, massive thank you to Sue Husband today, who, as people have said on the chat, has been a really great chair. So thank you, and it's been really good to work with business and the community, and hopefully we can carry on doing more work with you on this topic. And as this is the last one, thanks to the chairs over the series. But most of all, I suppose, thank you to everybody who's participated today and over the last 6 weeks. So it's a big thank you from me and the team at WCVA. So diolch yn fawr, pawb. And I think that's it. You have another minute to go on the chat before we'll be closing the session. So thanks again.